Well, hello there. Thanks for joining us tonight, right here at Bigfoot Lake. We have 3 amazing encounters to share tonight, so I hope you're excited for that. And speaking of encounters, we would love to hear yours. If you have a story you'd like to share right here at Bigfoot Lake with the Stumplings, send us one of those fancy email things, including all the details. Now, don't leave anything out now. Send it on over to bigfootprepper@gmail.com. I'll be watching for it. So enough of that now. Let's get settled in. Go on ahead, pull up a stump. Pull it right up here close to the campfire as we dive into our first encounter of tonight. Encounter number 1. I can hardly remember the date, but I do remember the events leading up to the sighting. It was a very warm fall day when my cousins and myself decided to do some hunting on horseback. The area that we hunted was the foothills of the Rockies on the Blackfeet Reservation in Big Sky Country. We had decided halfway into the trip to just take a ride and wait for Lady Luck to bring us something. All day was pretty good as far as the ride went, but I know that everybody still had the idea of getting a deer on their mind. We had decided to ride through a brushy trail, hoping to run into some game before we made it home. Most of the day was gone, and the evening sun was warming our backs as we made our way home. As we approached the trailhead, my cousin's horse was reluctant and fought the bridle bit for a while. We thought it was just because it was being newly broke. Once inside the brush, a good ways into it, our horses started stepping very softly and snorting once in a while, as if something didn't agree with their sense of smell. I could see the opening of the trail, and it would also be the end of the trail. One of my cousins was just about to say something when our horses began jumping in different directions, like they were scared of something. The first thing on all our minds was a bear. We began looking in different directions, trying to find the location of the bear. I don't remember who was the first to cite what it was we saw. I just heard him swear and ask the rest of us to look. We looked in the direction he was pointing and saw this very tall thing running on 2 legs beside us, and then turned in front of us. The thing crossed the trail in front of us about 40 feet and stopped at the edge of the brush. It just stared at us, as if in the same amount of amazement as we were, and then just disappeared into the trees just as fast. The best way I can describe it as probably the hairiest man I have ever saw, well past 6 feet tall. It was hard to determine the exact size, but the branches we found broke the next day were from 6 feet to about 8 feet in some places. Some footprints were found in places where the ground was soft, and along the trail we followed towards the mountains. This was the only sight we had since then, and this was when I was 14 years old. I am now 30, and probably the first one to tell anyone what we saw that day. That concludes our first encounter. Encounter number 2. This comes from the state of Oklahoma. When I was a teenager in the late 1970s, we lived year-round in a remote area next to a large lake that was rapidly developing as a weekend getaway for urbanites. The country was hilly and heavily wooded with streams and valleys and ravines. The hills have rock outcroppings and caves. By the time I was 14, I was roaming all around out there and often strayed miles from home. I can recall only one incident that spooked me personally. It would have been 1977. I was 15 years old and at least 3 miles from home, out hiking, and was working my way down a fairly steep decline, probably 50 degrees or more, on a day in late fall. This area had several large outcroppings and caves, and there were a few massive trees growing on the slope, and many smaller ones. What happened was all of a sudden, I got that proverbial tingling feeling at the back of my neck that I was being watched. Not only watched, but glared at. By that time in my life, I had already spent many days and nights out camping in the woods, and as I said, hiking, hunting, and fishing. I had never had a sensation like this before. I glanced around a little, but I did not look up. Whatever or whoever it was, I did not want them to realize that I knew they were there. I felt like that might provoke an attack or something, as odd as that may sound. I had a hunting knife with me and put my hand on the hilt. I also found a sturdy stick to use as a club, if need be. I quickly made my way down the rest of that slope. I knew that there was a forest trail at the bottom of it, and that the trail intersected a road a half-mile away or so. When I reached that trail, something let out a reverberating, yet somewhat high-pitched scream back up the hill, within 100 yards or so from where I was at. I didn't turn back to look. I just took off, running. It let out another scream a few seconds later, but my impression was that it had not moved. As I said, the scream was fairly high pitch, but it had a tremendous volume to it. It just seemed to reverberate all down the hillside. It was lower pitched and too throaty to be a bobcat, which I had heard many times in the past. And we weren't supposed to have mountain lions anywhere near our area. And again, the sound seemed lower pitch than the screams I had heard them make on nature shows. But at the time, that is what I chalked it up as being most likely a mountain lion. I told my family and several of my friends about it. Anyhow, I never went back to that part of the woods without having a loaded firearm with me. A few years later, I related this story to an elderly 80-year-old lady who has lived in this area her entire life. She had literally been born within a few miles of where this is located. She was from a large Native American family. She got an odd look on her face and a very serious tone in her voice, and told me I had encountered a Skinwalker. She said that when she was a young girl, she had a brother a few years older than her that came into their cabin one day, very excited about having seen an animal he had never seen before. He had been out in the woods hunting squirrels. The best way to hunt squirrels is to stealthily make your way to an area with lots of hickory trees. Then stay very quiet, watching and listening for their movements. He said that was what he was doing when he caught a glimpse of something dark in one of the trees. He said at first he thought it was just a trick of light, because it seemed to be a shadow that had moved on its own. He stayed quiet and hidden and watched and listened. The shadow began moving some more. and made its way down a tree trunk fairly quickly. He described it as being around 4 feet tall, built like a human, but somewhat hunched over, covered in long, dark, black-brown hair. When the thing reached the ground, the young man made some sound, perhaps a gasp or a sigh, and suddenly it stood completely upright, moving its head slightly, side to side, looking over his way. He described the face as being somewhat human-like, but covered with dark hair, and with something of a protruding snout, and the eyes as being very large and light-colored. It had an extremely angry look, even menacing. The thing bolted behind the tree and was gone. A minute or so later, the young man heard a high-pitched scream coming from high up in the trees, which was answered by another scream that came from elsewhere. That was what spooked him and caused him to rapidly leave. After he told this story to his family, the parents got serious and very worried, and reminded and warned the children again about skinwalkers. They described them as being evil forest spirits, not as big as humans, but just as strong, and also cunning and very malicious. The skinwalkers are supposed to be masters of camouflage. Their dark coloration and long fur and hair allow them to hide in the shadows, under the trees, very effectively. Plus, they have a tendency to only come out at night. The young man saw this thing just shortly before sunset. The skinwalkers supposedly hate humans. They will try to kill them if they can. Usually they target young children, luring them to stray away from their homes by mimicking the sound of a kitten or puppy, or sometimes mimicking the sound of a baby crying or kids laughing. If the skinwalkers can get a young child alone in the woods, they will strangle them. Another tactic is to get older children or even small adults alone and into water, like a creek or a pond. Then the skinwalkers will spring upon the victim and hold them underwater, drowning them. The elderly lady said that their parents warned them that if they ever see a shadow move independently while out in the woods, you must keep your eyes down and pretend like you didn't notice, but to go ahead and leave the area quickly, getting back to more lighted and open spaces. As an adult, I have heard and now researched a little about skinwalkers and realized that the term is generally used to describe myths of shapeshifters among the Native Americans of the Southwest, like Navajos and Hopi. But I am just telling you the story exactly as it was told to me. Again, this was in eastern Oklahoma, back in about 1984, and describing an incident that would have occurred in the area around 1915 to 1920. When I was a young child, my parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents warned me and other kids in our family to never stray into the woods by ourselves, and especially not if we heard what we thought was a kitten or a puppy. My family called it the boogeyman or child catcher, and basically said there was something out there that would kill young children if it could catch them alone, but never gave any more description than it was big and it was dark. I realized that folks tell their children such things to scare the kids, to keep them from wandering off and getting lost or hurt. But still, it makes you wonder if there might not be a kernel of truth behind the stories. And that concludes our second encounter. Skinwalkers. Ugh. Nasty critters, alright. Let me know what you think. So let's move right into our third encounter of the night. I spent 6 years as an Army Ranger. I don't know how many firefights I've been in. It's been a lot. I've seen some stuff. But this was a genetic level of fear. Like I was programmed to fear this thing. I've never been more terrified. Suddenly, it made sense why the woods creep me out, even when I'm armed. My wife, kids, and I were camping, Oregon. It's going to sound funny, but my ex-wife and I were being intimate when all this happened. We were camping on the eastern side of Cougar Reservoir and had just put our 2 kids down to bed a while earlier. We were stopped by our dog, who literally got in between us. We listened and could hear someone walking. I could feel its footsteps reverberating through the ground. They were slow, but covered a big range. When we first heard them, he was about 100 meters out. With 5 or 6 steps, he easily covered 40 meters. They were footsteps, padded feet, 2-legged cadence, not walking fast at all, rather slow, but covering massive amounts of distance with each step. The footsteps sounded like a baseball bat hitting a heavy bag. I got out of the tent and looked at it. I thought for a second it could even be an African elephant because of how huge it was. This thing was massive, about 10 feet tall. It was definitely not a bear. I lived not far away with an apple orchard, as well as a river that brought salmon every year and dealt with black bears regularly on my property. This was about 3 times bigger than the biggest black bear I've ever seen. It walked and looked like a huge person. I only had my 9mm, which would have done nothing. It started to charge me. Actually, it was more than that. It advanced slowly and stopped several times. It would start advancing as soon as my eyes turned away. I don't know how it was able to see. It was dense brush and it was dark. It got closer and stopped about 12 feet in front of me. It was not as scared as I was, not by a long shot. I could see it was hairy and dark colored, no eye shine and no smell, even though I stood right in front of it. I remember thinking I could almost lay down and would be about as wide as this thing's shoulders. They were massively wide, between 4.5 to 5 feet. I stood my ground. My wife loaded up the kids while I put myself between them and this thing. She acted swiftly with zero panic. It was actually pretty gangster to see her run towards it and me to get my son. I had to stay in front of it because of how close it got to the tent. I was sure I was just going to be the first to die. I was going to shoot its eyes before it killed me. With my kids on the line, I was going to do everything I could. I had a chance. I'm an ex-Army Ranger and I do a lot of shooting. Hitting its eye, even if it moved fast, wasn't out of the question. I felt like I could pull it off. And I had no choice. It's why I stood there and didn't run. I knew I probably wasn't going to make it, but if I could fight enough for my wife and kids to get out, I was going to die doing exactly that. But I didn't get the sense that this thing wanted to kill me for a few reasons. First off, it could have easily killed me already. I think seeing me stand my ground made this thing respect me. Plus, it came in loud. If something wants to kill you, it's going to be quiet. This thing was trying to be loud, scary, and not stealthy at all. Its advancing me definitely made me question my assessment, but it just didn't seem like he wanted me dead, just gone. Shoo! It was being nice and asking me to leave. This all happened in a span of approximately 30 seconds to maybe a minute. I backed up and got in the passenger seat of my car while keeping my pistol pointed low and towards it. We drove off. We discussed what to do and decided just to go home. Only a few miles down the road, in the middle of the night and in the middle of nowhere, we ran into a federal law enforcement officer. He was arresting someone. I explained we got chased out of our camp and that the fire was still lit, and I shot towards something big that walked towards us. He instantly went white. He pulled the guy out of his back seat, took the cuffs off, and let him go, and explained how lucky he was. He followed us back to our camp. He never used the word Bigfoot or alluded to this being anything weird. He told me he was a federal trapper for 8 years before becoming law enforcement. He knew what this was and stayed cool and professional. When we came back with federal law enforcement, the ribeye steaks we left out were still there. Nothing was destroyed. I don't know how, but I knew he wasn't going to return. We stayed the night and honestly slept great. The federal trapper / cop was there till 3 a.m. looking for tracks. He found hair and a huge bedding area right next to our camp, about 5 meters away. I think we just stole this big guy's nightly hangout spot. It was beautiful and remote. Easy access to water and only wilderness to the east. It looked like this thing was watching us for some time, and then went up the hill and started this whole scary charade. It was huge and only feet away for at least a while. I had no idea. Your initial encounter is Pandora's box, and the further you get into it, the weirder it gets. They aren't normal animals. We have to give credit to its intelligence. It can successfully avoid us in our own literal backyards. So that concludes our final encounter of the night. I really hope you enjoyed all 3. Now, take a few minutes and leave me some feedback in the comments, please. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, don't be bashful. And while you're at it, smack that thumbs up. I would greatly appreciate it, my friends. So with that, we're going to wrap up. So thanks again for joining us and pulling up a stump here at Bigfoot Lake. And hope to see you again soon. You take care now.